Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for your leadership. Historic societies like this are very, very important to our communities, and understanding and appreciating history is something that pays dividends. It helps us understand who we are today. It helps us understand where we're going in the future. And I think, as you're about to find out, most importantly, it's really interesting stories. So how many of you have heard of Phineas Pratt? Not too many. All right, good. So I came across the name Phineas Pratt while reading a book about the early Pilgrim settlers. And it was a name that I had not known, having studied history for most of my life. And the story that unfolded as I learned more about Phineas Pratt made him one of the most exceptional historic characters that I've ever encountered. So a little background on myself before I get going on Phineas, though. I grew up in New Jersey. I came here to Braintree about 20 years ago after having graduated from Boston College. I was just talking to Jane about Boston College, a fellow alum there. And it was while at Boston College that I got to have the great honor to have as one of my professors Thomas O'Connor. I'm sure that you know him. So a legend at Boston College and here at Braintree. And he inspired me to become a historian. I kind of parlayed that into a temporary job as a high school history teacher until I decided I didn't like teenagers. And then I moved into becoming a full-time tour guide. And I turned it into a career. I drove a trolley and a duck boat, and a few years ago I started my own company. And I give private tours of Boston and the surrounding area. And it's a great experience because unlike some of the big vehicles where you're talking at people, in my job I'm talking with people. So I get to meet fascinating people from all over the world and share New England history with them. So I always say my job's like traveling without ever leaving home. But I aim to be a lifelong learner, and another thing as part of that is that I've committed myself to this library, and I'm proud to say that I'm elected as a board member on the Board of Trustees. So I'd like to recognize Sunny Shaw, and Ann Tolan in the back there for her help with the great work we've done in the library. I'd also like to recognize Sunny. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening. And there's a treasure trove downstairs in the book racks of the library. And one of those I brought up here with me. And it's a book that was written by Thomas O'Connor, The Athens of America. And it's a reference to the great learning that's taken place here in Boston and New England. Just like the ancient Greeks emphasized in Athens knowledge and their past, so do we here. And this treasure trove from Thomas O'Connor has something even better on the inside. It's got a little love note to the people of Braintree. So if you ever happen to peruse the shelves in the library and you run across some Thomas O'Connor books, keep an eye out there because he's left little messages for each one of us. And by the way, if you take a look at that handwriting, clearly the product of a Catholic school education. Look at that. Fantastic handwriting. You don't see that much anymore. So it was while at Boston College that I started studying New England history and really grew a passion for it because there's no other place in America that has the history that we do. Of course, our history dates back to the founding of the Plymouth colony in 1620. And it's a fun time to be a historian because we're celebrating all these round numbers. You know, just last month we were celebrating the 250th anniversary of the first shots of the Revolution. And back, unfortunately, during the COVID year, we celebrated the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock. And it's in that context that the story of Phineas Pratt comes along. So let me just start with a little background beginning with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, as I'm sure you know, were separatists. They were from the northeast section of England. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims at the time. That's a term that wouldn't emerge until about the mid-19th century. They called themselves separatists. And it was a very dangerous thing to be. There was one and only one church in England at that time, and it was the Church of England. And you could literally be fined if you did not attend church services on a Sunday. Never mind if you questioned or if you wanted to start your own church. And so, facing persecution in their homeland of England, they left and went to Leiden, a town in the Netherlands, where there was a lot more religious toleration and where they could practice their faith as they saw freely. They lived there for approximately 11 years, long enough to begin having children and building families. But they noticed something that was disturbing to them. Their families were beginning to lose some of their English heritage. They were beginning to speak Dutch. They were beginning to take Dutch ways, and they desperately wanted to save their English heritage while at the same time following their faith as they saw fit. When an opportunity presented themselves, a man by the name of Thomas Weston, he was kind of a middleman, a businessman, if you will, and he approached the Pilgrims with this idea. He was working on behalf of a group that had got a charter from the king and had the opportunity to settle in the North American continent. And he proposed to these Pilgrims that perhaps they could go over, settle in that land on sort of a contractual basis, almost as if they were leasing the land from the owners of this property. They agreed to it. They saw it as an opportunity, and they purchased a small ship. The ship was called the Speedwell. Then they hired another ship called the Mayflower. And with about 120 of them, they set off on these two ships from Leiden, England. And shortly after they got out into the English Channel, the Speedwell began to have problems. So they docked quickly at Plymouth in England to reassess the situation. As they were in Plymouth, they decided that the Speedwell would not be able to make the journey. So they consolidated passengers, leaving some behind, and ultimately just over 100 of them got on board the Mayflower. They set off with this contract with what was going to be called the Plymouth Council of New England. The Plymouth Council of New England's charter occupied an entire swath of land from the Hudson River all the way up to the coast of Maine. And the original plan for these Pilgrims, these separatists, was that they were going to go down to the Hudson River, and that's where they would settle. But a storm pushed them off course as they sailed across the ocean, landing eventually in Cape Cod. And it was much later in the season than they had anticipated. They'd gotten that late start because of the delays with the Speedwell. And so, being late in the season, the captain of the Mayflower, a man by the name of John Smith, decided he would go no further. You have to appreciate, this man was hired by the Pilgrims to transport them. He had no vested interest in their church and their ideas. He just wanted to bring them across the ocean and get back safely. But it was too late in the season for that, and so he decided he wouldn't go any further, and together they decided that that would be their new home. They sat for several days off the coast of Provincetown in Cape Cod, and it was there that they decided to sign what was called the Mayflower Compact. Here's a famous painting of the Mayflower Compact. It was an agreement that established a civil body politic. So in other words, they were all going to cooperate with one another. And here's something that's really important to understand about them and the story that's about to unfold. They weren't all separatists. See, some of the people were there for the business aspects. They were called merchant adventurers. So of those approximately 102 people who were on the Mayflower, there, believe it or not, were only about 40 of them that were active members of the church. Many of the others were there for the business interests or to support them from a military standpoint. For instance, Miles Standish, who we'll talk about a little bit later on. So not everybody on the Mayflower was an ardent separatist. And as they arrived, they knew that their original plan was beginning to unravel. So signing the Mayflower Compact got all the men on the ship together and said, yes, we will cooperate, even though the plan had not gone as we originally expected. Now, it's important to remember that these were the first Englishmen that were going to live permanently year-round in the New World. But by no means were they the first Europeans to arrive in this area. As early as the 1580s, there had been trade routes that had been established between New England and the waters and the natives here and Europe. And so one of the most important trading places was up off the coast of Maine, off of Monhegan Island. It was an important beaver and fishing community. Even the name Cape Cod gives you a clue as to how plentiful the cod was in the Massachusetts Bay. And there was interactions between these fishermen who came over, not only from England, but from France, from the Basque region of Spain, from the coast of Portugal. And one of these fishing vessels captured a Native American by the name of Tisquantum. History knows him as Squanto. And he was brought, long before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, back to England. Well, not England originally. He was actually first brought to France, where he was sold into a slave market. And some Franciscan friars, some members of the clergy, bought his freedom for him, and released him. So he was released as a slave, a free man, and somehow made his way back on board a fishing vessel, perhaps as a charter captain, in other words, to show the other fishermen the coastal routes. But he eventually arrived back in the New World on another fishing vessel. And unfortunately for Squanto, when he arrived here, another effect of the arrival of these Englishmen was evidence, and that was the spread of disease. So a lot of the disease that was brought by the Europeans was not, the Native American population had no immunities for it. So the disease had wiped out, for instance, Squanto's village, which was called Pawtuxet. And Pawtuxet is what we know today as Plymouth, because when the Pilgrims, sitting off the coast of Cape Cod, looked and searched for a new spot to build their home, this abandoned Indian village of Pawtuxet made a perfect opportunity. So on Christmas Day in 1620, the Mayflower lands in Plymouth. They step off just as the winter is about to set in. And one important thing as we talk about these stories, we're going to talk about several winters into New England here, is to remember that at this time, they were experiencing much harsher and colder winters than we are experiencing today. Historians and climatologists called it a little ice age. And that first winter when those Pilgrims landed there was horrendous. Of the 102 people on board, 44 of them would not survive that first winter. And their leader, William Bradford, famously wrote in his book on Plymouth Plantation, "All great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties." That first winter, the Pilgrims were also very nervous about the presence of Native Americans. They could see them in the woods in the areas around them. They could see them being watched. And they worried, with so many of their own dying, that this might be seen as a weakness by the Native Americans. And so they were hesitant to encounter them. They had encountered them in several instances out on Cape Cod, and it hadn't always been a positive encounter. In one case, the Pilgrims took some corn from the Native Americans. In another, they had been fired on with bows and arrows by the Native Americans. So to say that relations were tense would be an understatement. But then a minor miracle happened. After that first devastating winter with nearly half of the Pilgrims dying, into their village walked Squanto. And to the amazement and surprise of these new settlers, he spoke English. He had been in England for a short time during his European period. And he became a negotiator and an ambassador between Massasoit, who was the tribal chief of the Wampanoag tribe, which Tisquantum would have been a member of, and he introduced Massasoit to the Pilgrims. And they decided to establish a treaty of mutual protection between the Pilgrims and the settlers. It's important to remember that Massasoit and the Wampanoag tribes occupied a vast area of eastern Massachusetts, but they were by no means the only Native American tribe in the area. There were rivals of the Wampanoag. The Narragansett were down in the south, or the Massachusetts were up to the north. Here's kind of a general outline of the tribal areas of that time period. You can see the Wampanoag in southeastern Massachusetts over about where Plymouth is. Down around Rhode Island is where the Narragansett had their area of influence. And then up around Boston and Braintree and where we are now would have been controlled by the Massachusetts. And these tribes were often at conflict with one another. And so when Massasoit signed this this agreement with the Pilgrims, it was a mutually beneficial agreement. It was an agreement that not only protected the Pilgrims, but it also helped the Wampanoag in their rivals, in their confrontations with their adversaries, especially the Narragansett. Well, after about a year, in 1622, another ship arrives in Plymouth Harbor. But this one carries no religious separatists at all. It's carrying, as William Bradford uniquely put it in his chronicles, 60 lusty men. They were most definitely not here for religious purposes. They were here to make money and trade with the Native Americans. There was great hope back in Europe that there might be gold in this part of North America. Unfortunately, that was not true. But the other thing that was quite valuable were beaver pelts. And beaver pelts were extremely lucrative industry. A beaver pelt could fetch you 7 acres of land in Europe. The beaver pelt was important, and it was a waterproof garment, essentially. Think of this. The beaver's hide is waterproof. The water whisks off it. And if you're wearing it as an outer garment, it's going to protect you in harsh conditions. So among these 60 lusty men looking to trade with the Native Americans and make a fortune was a man named Phineas Pratt. He was about 29 years old. Now, when these men arrived, led by Thomas Weston, remember Weston, he had been the negotiator that had convinced the Pilgrims to come over here. Now he's looking, again, to build a business. He They arrive late into the season, and while they get there late in the summer of 1622, they help the Pilgrims with the harvest. But unfortunately, 60 extra mouths to feed, especially after a devastating winter like they had previously experienced, was going to be problematic. And besides, they weren't going to get along necessarily with their ideas and philosophies. So Phineas Pratt and Thomas Weston and the rest of these merchant adventurers set off to establish another trading colony a little bit further up to the north. And it was around this time that a distressing piece of news arrives from Virginia. Down in Virginia, there were other English settlers, and there was news of a massacre where about 400 settlers down in Virginia had been killed by an Indian tribe. It became known as the Powhatan Massacre. Well, the establishment of the second colony in Massachusetts takes place not far from where we are right now. It takes place in modern-day Weymouth, in Wessagusset, in North Weymouth. And these 40 merchant adventurers, these lusty men, arrive in Wessagusset. Again, similar to Pawtuxet, it was an abandoned Indian village. They set up there in the late summer of 1622, and they established their new settlement. It's a perfect spot for a settlement. It's plentiful fishing right off of the Fore River, easy access to the inland waterways. It's actually a much better place to build a settlement than Plymouth was. And if you were down in Wessagusset today, C Street is the actual exact spot where that settlement would have been. Now, things have changed dramatically since 1622. The best way to understand what it would have looked like is to go over to the Great Hill Park. So this is a little Google map of Great Hill Park. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that. It's that very steep hill that overlooks Boston Harbor there in Weymouth. It's a fantastic spot to go watch fireworks on the 4th of July or just take a look at the harbor. But the steepness of that hill gives you an idea of the terrain and the way it would have looked over closer to C Street. C Street in that area was leveled over time, but you would have had these steep drumlins, these glacial deposits that formed these steep hills. And for this settlement in Wessagusset, the easiest thing for them to do was build a fortification, a palisades on top of this hill. Because again, like Plymouth, there were Native Americans in the woods who were watching and observing them. Sometimes they traded with them, but sometimes tensions could be felt. And almost immediately, they begin to have problems at Wessagusset. Having settled there late in the season, they're lacking food supplies, and they don't have enough stored away. They put a lot of time into making their fort, and so they didn't have enough time to trade or harvest the land. And there's a particularly intimidating Indian brave, a man that goes by the name of Pawtuxet. And this man wore a knife around his neck, and he told the New English settlers that that knife had belonged to a French fisherman who had come and was cast ashore in a shipwreck, and that Pawtuxet had taken that man's knife and killed him with his own knife and wore it as a sign of honor, as a war tribute, if you might. Things got so bad during that harsh winter of 1622 into 1623 that some of these English settlers actually left the English settlement and went to live amongst the Native Americans, almost as slaves, doing the bidding, fetching water, and chopping wood for the Native Americans. And then things really reached a breaking point around early March of 1623, when one of the English settlers was caught by the Native Americans stealing corn. He stole the corn, and the Native Americans confronted the English and wanted that man punished. The English had an agreement, or had a meeting at Wessagusset, and they came up with this unique solution. One of their club, one of the men in their community, was near death. And while he had not been the man who had stolen the corn, they hung him in place of the man who had stolen the corn. They called it death by proxy. You can imagine the moral consequences. And even for Native Americans, there was an injustice that had been done. And this was really a breaking point between the relationships of the Wessagusset settlement and the Native Americans. Pawtuxet confronted the Native Americans, and specifically Phineas, and he told him that this was an unjust way and that this was an insult to the Native Americans. And he began to make threatening gestures. He told Phineas that this knife that he wore around his neck, that it could not speak, it could not hear, but soon it would eat. Those words come directly from Phineas. The Native American braves started moving their encampments closer and closer to the settlement and the fort that they had. And Pawtucket said that Phineas had, the rumor was that Phineas was going to leave and go to Plymouth. So, sure enough, with this threat arriving, Phineas did follow through on this idea. Knowing that his settlement was in dire danger, he took off in the middle of a snowstorm and made his way on foot towards Plymouth. After this confrontation with Pawtucket, he left the encampment and made his way down what today is C Street, turning into Pleasant Street, heading south onto what essentially is Route 53 today. Route 53 would have been the old tribal pathways. Beginning in late March of 1623, with snow on the ground, he begins to make this desperate journey. Knowing that he's being pursued, that it's dangerous, and that it's at least a 3-day hike to get down to Plymouth. He gets to right about where Jackson Square is today, and there's a little body of water there, the Herring Brook Run. And he gets to that spot, and he begins walking backwards as he crosses the Herring Brook. He knows that the Indians who are going to follow him will follow his foot tracks, and he figures that if he can turn around and walk backwards, it might throw them off. He escapes across into the area of Black Rock, where Hingham is today. And he spends his first night hiding in a cave there somewhere in those rocks that are now known as Black Rock. He eventually gets away and makes it down to Plymouth about 2 days later. Tired, weary, he bursts into the Plymouth plantation in the settlement with the news that his settlement is about to be attacked. This is a map of the route going through Jackson Square there, right down Pleasant Street. It kind of give you some modern reference points of George Washington Toma and Denley's Garden, so you can kind of see where the path that Phineas would have followed. Absolutely. A lot of what we know about Phineas's travels and story comes from two descriptions or affidavits that he presented to the General Court of Massachusetts later in his life. And the Massachusetts Historical Society has copies, the original documents of these. It was entitled A Declaration of the Affairs of the English People That First Inhabited New England. And this is where the story comes from. It's really an amazing story. Phineas's deposition he gave two. The first was in 1662. And one phrase from that really struck me. 30 miles I was pursued for my life in a time of frost and snow as a deer chased by wolves. Once he got to Plymouth, he alerted Miles Standish, who was the military coordinator for the Pilgrims. Miles Standish was essentially a soldier of fortune and had been hired and brought over with promises of land by the Pilgrims to help protect them. Miles Standish, knowing that this is an imminent threat, and a threat not just to the Wessagusset settlement, but potentially to the Plymouth settlement. Because if the Wessagusset settlement had been wiped out, the same more than likely would have happened to the Plymouth settlement. Even though they had alliances with Massasoit, this was still a major threat. So Miles Standish hops in a boat, sails up the coast to Weymouth, to Wessagusset, and he invites Pawtucket and some of his other Native American braves in for a meeting. He entices them with a meal of pork, which was an unusual meal for them. And while in that meeting, a fight breaks out. Miles Standish attacks these Indians. He kills Pawtucket and another man named Widowwootmot. Those two Native Americans were killed. The rest of them flee for their lives. But that puts an end to the threat to the Wessagusset settlement at that immediate moment. They take the head of Pawtucket and they put it on a stake, and they carry the stake back to Plymouth. And for many years, the head of Pawtucket was displayed outside of the gates at Plymouth. Phineas, who did not make the trip back to Wessagusset with his men, stayed in Plymouth. And one of the most amazing parts of this heroic story of Phineas is that he builds a second life in Plymouth. He settles down there. Most of the men in Wessagusset went back to England, or some of them, the ones who had been indentured, if you will, to the Native Americans, were killed in the immediate aftermath. that the Native Americans, upon learning of this fight with Miles Standish, killed the few English that were left. Most of them returned back to England, but a few, like Phineas and even his brother Joshua, chose to stay in Plymouth. And Phineas signs a contract to become an indentured servant for 7 years with one of the original Pilgrim settlers. He works that contract off and eventually is given a piece of land in Plymouth. He marries a woman named Mary Priest, and he fathers 8 children with her. Eventually, he sells off some of his Plymouth land, and he moves up to Charlestown, and in the newly settled area of Boston, where John Winthrop and the Pilgrims had arrived. And in 1646, he relocates up there to Charlestown. He lives the rest of his life in Charlestown, and even establishes a large piece of property up on the Merrimack River. Because thanks to that initial deposition that he had given to the General Court, the legislative body of Massachusetts, they granted him some 300 acres of land. So here is this man, as a young boy, who had come over as a merchant adventurer, who had encountered near-death experience, who had this second chance at Plymouth Plantation, built that up into a huge estate. He's buried up in Charlestown today. He's over at the Phipps Street Cemetery in Charlestown. And this is a picture of his grave. Phineas lived to be almost 90 years old. And one of the last depositions that he gave was asking the General Court for assistance. Towards the end of his life, he was, well, I'll put it in his words. Now in times of prosperity, I beseech you, consider the day of small things. For I was almost frozen in time of weak beginnings, and now I am lame. It is my humble request to ask for my subsistence for the remaining time of my life. Essentially what he's asking the General Court for there at that point is basically the first pension in Massachusetts history. He's asking for money. He's 90 years old, and he's looking to be supported by the government. So, you know, as I said at the beginning, we study this history not just to learn about the past, because these are fascinating stories, and as long as we tell these stories, we keep them alive, and we keep memories of men like Phineas alive. And we can do it not just by telling their stories, but by reliving their stories. And when I learned of Phineas' story, I was inspired by it. And around the 400th anniversary of his flight from Wessagusset to Plymouth, I attempted to do the same thing. I took the 30-mile trip by foot, partly running, partly walking. It took me about 4.5 hours, and I made it from C Street down to Leiden Street, which was the heart of Plymouth. So that's a picture of my route. If you want to try it for yourself, Google Maps says it takes about 10 hours. So, but I think that when we remember and learn stories like this, it helps us appreciate some of the trials and tribulations, not just of the big names that we know from history, but of many of the smaller names. And I know that there are relatives of Phineas Pratt that are around. The Pratt name is still quite popular. And so it's that man's daring and legacy, I think, that made that all possible. And let me just add these two things. If you have any interest and you want to learn more about it, a book where I originally learned the story is written by a man named Nick Bunker. It's called Making Haste from Babylon. Of course, if you want to go to the original, this is William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. The greatest passage in Plymouth Plantation, in other words, the longest passage on a single particular incident on Plymouth Plantation, is his description of what happened at the Wessagusset settlement. So there you go. That is the story of Phineas Pratt.